Satas, this is the Global Digest Think Tank Group. Please, why don't you introduce to our audience?
Sure. So, firstly, thank you so much for your time today and for giving me the platform. Like I mentioned, my name is Asta Chadha, and I work as an associate professor of international relations at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. I work in the College of IR here. And basically, I teach courses related to South Asian foreign policy, South Asian international relations, Indo-Pacific security, Japan-India relations. And I work in terms of research on how religion impacts international relations.
Asta, you may know recent geopolitics and regional issue. So I don't know how Japanese and India situation in Indo-Pacific at the moment. Can you say India and Japan are going along together, or uh, Japan is clear its position is remain as U.S. alliance and even strongly military alliance. They are under tuteling one command military with U.S. But India is not like that. So how do you see India, Japan, uh, on the same path, or how can you say that?
Right. So, see, India and Japan have had very close relations. At least the way I see them progressing with the bilateral relationship, it has only gotten closer and deeper. And in terms of scope, it has gone wider. So, if you look at their respective foreign policies, as you rightly mentioned, Japan's foreign policy has been quite aligned with that of the United States, and militarily also it aligns very well with the US objectives, security objectives in the Indo-Pacific. India, on the other hand, seeks to maintain a more independent and autonomous foreign policy. It also seeks to maintain its strong bilateral relations with the countries that are in the Indo-Pacific and even beyond the region. However, India and Japan are not together because they have to uh, create an alliance of some sort. They are there because they do understand that sharing certain values, whether that is democracy or whether that is the fact that both of them seek a secure, stable international order in the Indo-Pacific. So, for those reasons, they feel that the Indo-Pacific in general provides them the platform to work together as two nations coming together with the same development objectives. So, how I look at it is they don't have to have overlapping aims when it comes to foreign policy, but their objectives and the way they envision security in the region, the way they look at Indo-Pacific as a region which is open, inclusive, and prosperous for all countries, those objectives are definitely shared objectives. So, like I mentioned, it provides them a platform to work together with third countries or work together in a more multilateral, quadrilateral, trilateral setup. And for those reasons, India and Japan find various opportunities and platforms to do so. So, if you look at how they are investing together in the Indian Ocean, such as in Sri Lanka, or investing in projects together in Bangladesh, or whether it's in the northeast of India, the development projects that are being funded by Japan and being supported by India, or being jointly funded by both of them, have common objectives for both the nations. So they are working together, and they are in a way providing a stencil or an example of a relationship which can be followed by other nations that want to work in this bilateral setup or a trilateral setup.
Let's see. So, uh, how far, how far, how, I mean, the Indo-Pacific Forum, or how can you say the proper name of, is there any multilateral agreement or any proper documentation signed by all these four countries in that Quad? So how can you identify there is former Quad forum, or it's informal, or it's in which criteria?
See, we need to look at it from three different perspectives. One is what are the individual four countries of US, Australia, India, and Japan doing in Quad, and how do they look at the region, right? So, one is their independent foreign policy. So, for the United States, we do see that it has a very clear Indo-Pacific strategic outlook. It has published how its strategic and defense documents. It keeps mentioning how it looks at Indo-Pacific. In case of Japan, it does have an Indo-Pacific policy, and actually, very recently, Japan launched a new Indo-Pacific policy under its previous Prime Minister Kishida, right? So we do see Japan also envisions Indo-Pacific in a certain way, which is quite similar to that of United States. Australia as well has its own independent Indo-Pacific policy. India, on the other hand, does not have a document that says India's Indo Pacific strategy or India's Indo Pacific policy. But India looks at the entire region through its outlooks that it has, one of which is Sagar, which is security and growth for all in the region, on which it is mainly focusing on the Indian Ocean security. Then, together with that, India has its Act East policy, which means linking India with the eastern neighbors, which includes countries like South Korea and Japan. And of course, on a bilateral basis, India has strategic partnership agreements with all of the three nations. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is how these three countries or four countries are working in minilateral setups, right? So you see India, Japan, and United States earlier had a JI trilateral, which is Japan, America, and India trilateral. Similarly, Japan, US, and Australia have an established trilateral. So they're working in these small triangular triadic partnerships because they do see an overlap of security objectives or overlap of development objectives in the region. The third aspect, which you mentioned, is that of Quad. Is there a signed agreement between the four countries that allows them to work? Well, for a very long time, the four countries were not very keen on actually calling it a quadrilateral security partnership, right? So you will see that people on all sides continue to call it consultative mechanism to work in the Indo-Pacific, or it was just an informal meeting on the sidelines of another event for a very long time. But as for signing of agreements, they do have a lot of agreements coming up, such as we saw during COVID or post-COVID, when the US committed to fund the pharmaceutical industry in India and said that that would be the hub within India that would supply medicines to rest of the world. Or you do see them trying to collaborate together on food security, collaborate together in terms of technology partnerships, right? Talking about development of, let's say, human capital. So we do see US and other nations within the Quad framework launching Quad scholarships, which allow people or skilled labor from all the four countries to go to each other's nations and upskill. So we do have these little mechanisms. However, since it is not a security partnership in terms of purely defense, right? It is not an Asian NATO. Hence, you would probably not find that kind of document outlining what sort of security partnership they look at. So I look at Quad more of as a developing platform. It could take many other forms. However, at this point, it is a good consultative mechanism where the four countries are trying to find common ground on which they can continue to cooperate.
Right. I mean, it's likely you want to clarify it's a kind of informal, like consultation. The group, the quad is such kind of thing. It seemed like that, you know, uh, in terms of Japan, US, Australia is strongly dedicated. They really they make commitment for any reason, for any aspect. They will join hands together, either military way or foreign policy direction. They will do it together and release all their military strength and all these capacity once the threat or any uh, problem arise in the region. It's visible the way their dedication, but in case of India, it's not that much committed, right? Compared to the other three countries. India is and this. Uh, they willing to accompany with them, but not really to uh, deeply engage or totally committed into them. And how much do you think India were willing to open or allow them this kind of strong commitment, the same with the other three countries? How do you see? And it will be never happen.
You're very right in your observation when you say that it is difficult to see which direction India wants to take, specifically when it comes to military alignments, right? And what needs to be clarified here is that India does not engage in making alliances, right? So all we see from India is probably a foreign policy shift, so to say, away from its traditional stance of being completely non-aligned to a nation which is more open to closer partnerships, especially with the United States, right? So that is clearly visible. When it comes to the other aspects of the relationship, such as, military engagements, India keeps dropping these hints, which in a way signal that it is deepening its relationship with the other three nations. For example, India and US used to, together with Japan, they used to conduct something called the Malabar exercises, right? And at some point, Japan joined it, but Australia was still not part of it. And now we are heading towards one of those events wherein Australia will formally become part of the Malabar exercise. So, several years ago, this conversation would probably be difficult to envision that the four countries together would be doing some sort of a military or a naval exercise, right, in the Indo-Pacific. But now it is happening. Similarly, we do see that while Japan and Australia and United States are in a way supporting and assisting Philippines in some way, India was playing a relatively very passive role in ASEAN. And then now you see India is coming forward, developing its own defense sector, and hence trying to, of course, make a sale of its missiles to Philippines, or trying to conduct some exercises or talk about the possibility of conducting Coast Guard exercises or military exercises with ASEAN nations. So when we see regularity of those events happening, right, we can probably gauge that India is trying to make itself more visible in the security architecture in the region. But to expect that India is going to abandon its stance and probably at some point align, it is very, very difficult to talk about it at the moment, since India maintains its foreign policy, which is in a way structured in a sense that does not allow it to engage with alliances, basically. So it will continue to build partnerships. It will probably continue to engage further with the partner nations, but it's difficult to see, in at least in the short run, India trying to create an alliance of some sort.
I see. Maybe India and Japan can be deadlocked when it comes to Russia. When Japan and Russia are tension in
Mm-hmm.
terms of military and dispute at the border. And if any conflict, that India will be not really willing to be part of Japan in that case, because Russia is Indian uh, traditional alliance, military alliance. Even India trusts more Russia than America, I guess, in terms of military, although we know foreign policy or economic or in terms of democracy, it's closer to America, but military side, India will not let them go with America. It seems India appearance like that, and you know, Also in Indo-Pacific, especially Indo-Pacific in the west of part of India, like a lot of the multilateral military, combined military in the western part of India, which U.S. and Pakistan again together with the Arab and those Gulf countries. They protect and they control all the uh, security in that region. But India was not part of them in the western part. Maybe India and was there itself alone in that case. So if you see, uh, although India joined, especially Indo-Pacific, eastern side of Indian Ocean, with the US, Australia, Japan together. So in that context, some are agreeable, some are not agreeable, or some are cooperated, or some are not cooperated. How can you say?
See, there are two parts to that question that we need to understand, and I am going to try and talk about it in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on one hand, and maybe possible threat that Japan especially feels from it, and on the other hand, the conflict that's going on in the Middle East. So, you are right when you say India has been a close defense partner of Russia. And however, there is no alliance there either. And like you rightly pointed out, that relationship between India and Russia as defense partners uh, can be traced back to Cold War era politics and how India found a more stable or reliable, let's say, nation partner in Russia at that point, or USSR at that point, and which allowed that relationship to flourish even post 1991 between India and Russia. So Russia has been our India's defense supplier and has been consistently together with India, even in terms of joint development of weapons or defense sector. However, if you look at the current conflict, you will notice that the way Indian foreign policy has upgraded itself or has maybe changed itself, which allows it to balance both the relationships rather than choosing one over the other. In some aspect, it does mimic the Cold War political stance of India, where India said we are the third front or the non-aligned nation. But in the current stance, you can see India is not really sitting on the fence. It is very much engaged in the Indo-Pacific. It is engaging with the neighbors in the West. It's engaging with the neighbors in the East and friends in the West as well as in the East, while continuing to maintain its defense partnership with Russia. So if there is a threat that Japan or any other nation feels from Russia, that probably India would see as a bilateral issue that needs to be resolved bilaterally. And India would probably not intervene in that aspect. When it comes to the conflict that's happening in the Middle East, again, you will notice a huge shift that has happened in the Indian foreign policy. So earlier, given the religious or the cultural affinity the Arab nations shared with countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan, used to be a big factor in why India was not able to flourish its relationship with its Arab neighbors, right? However, since 2014, we do see India overcoming that aspect of just let's say letting its relationship with the Gulf go or operate under capacity by moving beyond and above its religious diplomacy and going and talking more business with those countries that are ready to also invest in India. So we do see a clear shift wherein India is willing to go beyond its mere identity related issues that it shared with Pakistan or with its neighbors and go beyond it and carve sort of a new sort of a platform where India as well as the Gulf can cooperate, whether it's in defense or whether it's in newer technologies or green energy, or we are talking about food security, right? So they are cooperating on several of these aspects. Now, with the conflict that's going on in the Middle East, again, you will see that India has tried to change its foreign policy stance. So, for a very long time, India maintained that a two-state solution, let's say for Israel and Palestine, would be the best solution, right? And India did not try and further its relationships with Israel for a very long time. However, we now see India is taking a shift from that. So, without supporting the US stance or without supporting any other third country stance, India is taking an independent position on the war, saying that this is not an era of war. However, there needs to be peace on both sides, right? So without holding any one party responsible, India is ready to be partner to all. So whether United States supports that position or whether India supports Russian position is basically irrelevant to how all of these countries together need to work on Indo-Pacific security. And I think that is what a lot of these countries have evolved with. They have they have in a way accepted and evolved with this idea that there cannot be an absolute overlap of security objectives in any region between two parties, especially when it comes to countries like India. So they need to cooperate where a common issue arises. They need to find those grounds of issue based partnerships and issue based alignments in the region, which eliminates any need for, let's say, alliance politics.
So India is playing here and there and different group and different partnership. It's look like that, and you may see recently India-China border deal. Maybe do you know that India national security advisor and Chinese foreign minister meeting a few days ago, and they have properly agreement. They started, but I don't know. It may be not yet detailed, probably, but they try to initiate that proper agreement. Do you think it will solve out those border dispute between India and China, and how the progress and what they did it?
Yeah, see, the border dispute between India and China has always been a separate issue when we look at how they do business. So, their economic relationships and their military sort of tussle that has happened have gone parallelly, even historically. So let's just go very recent in back during COVID, when Indian and Chinese forces were clashing at the Himalayan border. It was not as if their business stopped. In fact, if you look at how much trade happened between India and China, it just continues to grow and soar. And so, what that tells us is that for a country like India, at least immediately, it is impossible to completely economically decouple from China. Given that reality, and I mean, in a way, it is the same for China too. It does need partners or and big markets like India to continue to, maintain its economic position. So, given that reality, I think it was a practical sort of step on both sides to try and negotiate some sort of a disengagement, or it's at least lessening of that tension that was at the border. However, to say that the border dispute is resolved is probably going to be a far cry, because you do see that the border continues to be one heavily militarized. Both sides have not really reduced their troops at the border. That's one. Second, the border dispute can only be resolved once there is an agreement on what part of that Himalayan territory belongs to which side of the border, right? And there is none of that consensus as of now. And one reason for that is that both of them have very different ideas of where the national territories begin and end, right? Which creates that sort of a buffer zone wherein both the militaries now want to be. They want to make their presence felt. So, what has been agreed upon is that peacefully they will continue to be militarized along the border, but not engaged in armed conflict. That's the military aspect of it. When we look at the development aspect of the border, both sides, India and the Chinese side, they understand that both of them will continue to develop that region in terms of infrastructure. And neither of the sides can stop the other side, right? And that takes me to the economic aspect. They know that to continue to have populations thriving on both sides of the border, they need to provide them some economic, activity and economic linkages to rest of the country. Plus, since there is heavy militarization, the military troops need to continue to use that area for movement. And as for the India-China bilateral trade, they know that given that there is a new presidency coming up in the United States, I think both the sides are in a way preparing for it and looking at how they can at least secure their economic relationship, irrespective of what continues to happen in rest of the world, right? And so I see that both as a good and welcome step from Indian side to agree to, let's say, talk to the Chinese counterparts on this aspect and make sure that they prioritize diplomatically resolving the conflict rather than engaging militarily. I also think this is a very welcome step from the Chinese side to agree to disengage and to try and engage more with India in terms of economics, try and engage more in terms of trade and bilateral partnership, which, by the way, should also include people-to-people partnership, right? People-to-people development of relations, because both the countries are civilizational states and they have been partners for a very long time. So conflict is not in favor of either of the nations. They have clashed once, they have clashed several times recently. So they do understand that it's not going to be a beneficial conflict for either of them.
So the border dispute between India and China, as you said, physically nothing yet happened. They will still hold a gun, but let not shoot the gun each other, something like that.
Yes.
Their intention is like that, and they want to talk, as you said, diplomatically, but not any step physically. They will they will do it, and they were still holding guns, something like that. So it means the complete solution will be not likely to happen anytime soon. So it's still a long way. India-China border dispute. India, do you mean India is really think to able to solve the border between India China is, you mean only after Tibetan independence it can be solved, or how do you see, or it will be never happen again?
I mean, it doesn't hurt to be hopeful, but realistically speaking, India and China share one of the longest land borders, right? It runs several thousands of kilometers, and there are sections of that shared territory. So one of that is in the northern part of India, which is close to Ladakh region, which you mentioned, is borders the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Then there is a second section which is close enough, which is between Nepal and Bhutan, and it kind of that's a state of Sikkim. And then the third one is the Indian Northeast, which is Arunachal Pradesh on the Indian side, which China claims as South Tibet. Right. So, given that long border, the kind of issues and the number of parties involved also changes. Right. So, when we talk about Kashmir, which is now no longer just Jammu and Kashmir. It has been further bifurcated into Ladakh. So when we talk about Ladakh, you have India and China sharing that border. There is still, like I mentioned, there is heavy militarization. There has been disengagement, but there is still presence of lots of troops. And there is no consensus on where exactly the land borders begin and where they stop being for either of the nations. So there is still that confusion that needs to be negotiated and that needs to be clarified. When we talk about Sikkim and the areas that maybe India, Bhutan, and China are heavily militarizing and sharing, that's where the Doklam conflict happened earlier, right? There is still no consensus as to what extent China can probably come in and militarize that area, or to what extent India can go and defend its territories. And when we come to the third part, which is India's northeast, which is the state of Arunachal Pradesh, China more or less entirely claims that state, and India maintains that it is an inalienable part of India, right? So when you look at that kind of a confusion or that kind of a a disagreement on history, a disagreement on cultural relations, or a disagreement on which part of the territory certain areas belong to, those disputes are very difficult to resolve overnight. So, irrespective, like I mentioned, of their closeness in terms of trade, irrespective of their interdependence in terms of economic partnership, I do not see India and China being able to completely resolve that border dispute unless there is, of course, a mediated some sort of a discussion between both the sides wherein they genuinely seek a complete resolution and a permanent solution to this border conflict. And as of now, I do not see either of the parties willing to invest politically in resolving that conflict.
At the Ladakh, that you in India and China, you clearly said there is no properly cut which started and which ended the line. So maybe I don't know. It means it will unlikely to cut any time the line between India and China, and that is uh, part of Tibet. Ancient time Tibet government, India has their historical relationship with Tibetan government, and so it's mean you need to talk with Tibet government again, and it will not able to cut the line without Tibet.
Right. See, as far as India and Tibet relations are concerned, you rightly mentioned, the India had maintained a relationship with Tibet when it used to be an independent autonomous territory. However, ever since Dalai Lama has been living in India, and ever since the government in exile of Tibet has been operating out of India, the whole equation between India-China relation has completely changed, right? So earlier Tibet used to be that one large territory, which was in a way a zone that separated India from China completely. However, now India and China share borders, right? So there is no clearly delineated border between the two countries because the way it was divided, there is still no consensus on it, right? There's no consensus on where Tibet ends or what part of it should be controlled by China and what part of it should be controlled by India, which is why the agreement that both the countries have as of now is that both militaries on both sides can continue to patrol certain regions together. So they can carry weapons, but they cannot fire those weapons at each other, right? As far as Tibet and Tibet's independence is concerned, see, that is something that only Tibetans should have the right to determine, right? So if they want to stand up for it and if they want to fight it, they already have a government in exile operating from India. But I do see a lot of movement happening on that aspect since you mentioned it. I mean, we recently saw there were parties from the United States coming and trying to talk to people from the Tibetan government in exile, or giving them the space and the political platform to talk about their self-determination. So I think that is a long drawn event that needs to be watched very carefully. It is difficult to say which way it's going to go as of now. However, there is a possibility that this could pick up steam and then we could see some political developments happening on that end. But it is something that we will need to watch in the long run. It's difficult to see it manifesting anytime very soon.
But internationally, in this year, Biden administration, U.S. also made a kind of Tibetan Act, something like that, legally. So it means it shows the support of Tibet freedom, and India cannot avoid definitely because it's next to India, and India, as you said, even uh, physically border is critical. Even uh, can you say during Tibetan government before Chinese Communist Party, it has any agreement or you have more uh, favorable or possible solution about border issue with Tibet? India democracy government and communist government is more difficult to talk or engage.
See, the relationship that India shared earlier with China on Tibet and the relationship now, I mean, of course, it has transformed over time given the situation of Tibet itself, right? However, when it comes to supporting Tibetan independence or Tibetan political, let's say, ambition or Tibetan political self-determination, I think India has always supported it. Otherwise, it would have been difficult for a huge Tibetan population to continue to live in India and continue to uphold the movement that they hold politically, right? Whether it's together with Dalai Lama or whether we are just talking about the youth that have for the longest time been out of Tibet and been living in India. So they do find their political voice. Such as the Dalai Lama and certain Tibetan population that lives in Dharamshala in India, they continue to find the voice. However, you were right when you mentioned that given that the issue has picked up more steam now in the recent past when the Biden administration tried to take some initiatives on that front and try to give voice to the Tibetan population, but as I mentioned, it is something which is still in a very nascent step. We don't know which way it's going to go still, right? We do understand that Tibetan population in general might have political ambitions, but it's difficult to see how internationally it might be supported in the long run. So that is an event that I also am looking at it very very closely and I'm monitoring it. But we'll need to see it and look at it in a long term. We'll also need to see how China will respond to it, right? So when there were visits by Nancy Pelosi or anyone else from the American delegation to talk to the Tibetan population or the Tibetan leadership, it was not taken very well by China. They look at it as an interference in their domestic matters, right? So this is something that needs to be balanced. If any dialogue or a political, let's say, engagement needs to happen with Tibet,